Alright guys, real quick, I had this longer video where I talked about the censor myth as a component of the judge myth. And actually I had missed that he basically had already named, it's very similar to, maybe it is what I was referring to as a censor myth. He had already named it in the part that I had read, but not to you guys. So we're on page 80 in David McRaney's How Minds Changed. It's called naive realism, and it's the belief that you perceive the world as it truly is, free from assumption, interpretation, bias, or the limitations of your senses. And of course, if you watch this channel, we would rephrase that. Let me read just the sentence before it as well. In psychology, there's a term for this cognitive blind. Okay. Let me read the sentence before that, this last sentence of the paragraph before. The result is that we argue endlessly over our subjectivity to convince one another of something that doesn't feel subjective. It feels like the raw, unfiltered, unassailable truth. In psychology, there's a term for this cognitive blind spot, for when your disambiguations feel undeniably true. It's called naive realism, and it's the belief that you perceive the world as it truly is. So let's put a period there. And then I want to change his qualifications here. Free from assumption, interpretation, bias, or limitation of your senses. That makes sense if you believe that the underlying default system is one that's reasonable. And then there are sort of assumptions, well, bias that can influence it. It says free from bias, or the limitations of your senses. Limitation of your senses is great, but let's also remember the fact that your mechanisms are only imitating reason. There is no underlying reasonable system. So I want to rephrase it as, it's called naive realism, and it's the belief that you perceive the world as it truly is. That your interpretive mechanisms are perfectly calibrated to the world. As though your mechanisms are not just biological feats that were adaptive because they imitated reason, and as though your senses aren't just biological senses that evolved to see some of reality. Again, it's called naive realism, and it's the belief that you perceive the world as it truly is. He says, free from assumption, interpretation, bias, or limitation of your senses. I say, ignoring the fact that your mechanisms are not perfectly calibrated to reality, and were calibrated according to evolution and natural selective demands in an attempt to imitate the reason that would be required to survive and reproduce and, make basic decisions in our, according that we had to make in our adapted period, in our hunter-gatherer society.